Hi, I'm Charles Fournier, and I'm going to be talking about Hemingway and writing. So Hemingway always had the goal of becoming famous. This was largely tied to being a writer, but he wanted to become that person that people knew. And so the idea of becoming famous tied to writing started early on. When he was in high school, he wrote for his newspaper, his high school newspaper, and he also ended up becoming the editor for that newspaper. After high school, he ended up working for newspapers, and he over the years became a war correspondent. So this idea of writing for a newspaper was consistent within his life, and that also informed a lot of how he wrote. Hemingway had a very concise style because early on he had an editor that said, you need to cut words out. And so he became very concise. And so he developed this style of being a little bit choppier, a little bit more concise. And this essentially matches with the time in which he was writing. So Hemingway is considered to be a modernist writer. He's writing at the time post-World War I, and modernism could be argued to have started as early as 1900, but still he's within that modernist time frame. And much of modernism was tied to moving away from the past, of changing that structure and trying to have an art form that fits the modern world that seems hectic, especially with something like World War I, where people are developing new machines and new mechanisms of killing people. And so being a modernist writer, Hemingway is essentially changing the form of writing, or changing his form of writing, as a way to stand apart. And also part of this is seen as he was inspired by other artists. Paul Cézanne is a famous painter at the time who would take essentially a very full painting and then slowly work back and try to have as few lines as needed to still have an inference for what the scene was behind it. So if he had a mountain range, he would just have a few lines to represent the mountain and the stream or the trees. And this was his effort to be very much in that minimalist structure. And Hemingway liked that. He tried to impose that into his writing. And so he had this minimalist structure that a lot of times we see as the iceberg effect, where you have this top layer and then the water level and then this massive information underneath. And so within Hemingway's writing, we see this minimalist structure, these light brush strokes that you can infer a great deal of meaning underneath that. So when Hemingway was kind of gaining his writing chops, he went to Paris in the early 1920s. He was friends with F. Scott Fitzgerald, who wrote The Great Gatsby. He was friends with Gertrude Stein, who was a famous poet, and Ezra Pound, another famous poet. And he was, though he denies it later, he was essentially mentored by Gertrude Stein and Ezra Pound. He admired James Joyce, who was in the same area at the time, and so he was around this wealth of writers. Part of Hemingway's experience with his writers was also an element of competition. So in 1925, F. Scott Fitzgerald published The Great Gatsby, and he got a lot of positive feedback from that. And Hemingway's response was kind of like, yeah, I could do better. And so he wrote The Sun Also Rises, which was published in 1926. And this was his response to say, I can also create a great work. And it took him just a few months, but to write a great work that also got kind of the same, hopefully, press in his mind that F. Scott Fitzgerald got. So in his writing, when reading Hemingway, it's worth noting that he is not on an island. Hemingway is aware of the culture of the time, he's aware of mainstream America, and that's essentially what he's writing for. And so even when thinking about the title of his book, For Whom the Bell Tolls, that comes from a poem that essentially says, it's no man is an island, ask not for whom the bell tolls for thee. And it's this idea that if somebody dies, it's everyone's pain. And so this idea that you're not an island, you're not by yourself. And Hemingway does that in his writing. He's not writing just for himself, he's writing for an audience. And we see that in how he depicts his characters and how he essentially writes towards a hegemonic or a mainstream culture. He does not oppose that culture very often. He writes to essentially reiterate what that culture is already putting out. Also, when thinking about or reading Hemingway's work, it's worth paying attention to his landscape. Nature has always been a big influence in his life, and landscape, when we're thinking about the minor brushstrokes in his writing, the landscape represents a greater amount of things. When reading The Big Two-Hearted Rivers, Parts 1 and 2 out of the In Our Time collection, it's worth noting that when Nick Adams, the character, gets to the scene, everything is burnt. And he slowly works throughout the stories away from death towards life, away from the burnt towards good fishing and nature. And we see this as also a movement of Nick Adams coming from war, moving away from that death and destruction towards life, towards something that has a little bit more value. Now, as Hemingway writes, he gains obviously fame, and in 1953, he wins the Nobel Prize for Fiction for The Old Man and the Sea, and then in 1954, he wins the Nobel Prize for Literature. He'd been nominated a couple times before, but he actually won it this time. And his acceptance speech is recorded, so if that's something that people are interested in listening to, that's accessible. When he got older, this was part of Hemingway's, maybe we see depression being a part of his life. It was within his family. It was his inability to write towards the end of his life. He was struggling to get pages down. When he spent a lifetime of writing, he had a very hard time getting that writing down. One thing that's also worth noting is that several of his books, including Garden of Eden, A Movable Feast, and A Dangerous Summer, were published posthumously, so after he died. So it's worth noting that when looking at those books, they were edited maybe by family members or other editors, but they weren't necessarily exactly what Hemingway had written down. And it's also worth noting that those books were written over several years, whereas his maybe two arguably more famous books were written in just a couple months. The Sun Also Rises and The Old Man and the Sea took maybe 3 months in total to write each. And so he had these texts that are published now, and they're out in the open, which we could argue maybe he didn't ever want those out, especially when thinking about topics that are within those books. Hemingway, as we said, is writing for a mainstream American audience. In The Garden of Eden, we have a couple who have some gender bending, and there's some things that aren't necessarily tied to maybe what's acceptable in America. Yes, it happens overseas, but again, this is something that Hemingway did not publish while he was alive. And so when thinking about his writing, it's worth noting when he's writing and also what he decided to publish and what he decided to keep to himself.